Welcome to onSodi.com.
This video lesson is the introduction video for understanding contrast. We will be using Adobe Camera Raw, also known as ACR, to demonstrate the theories and visual results of contrast control, although it is better to adjust contrast in Adobe Camera Raw prior to opening into Photoshop. The visual effects of contrast on the image and on the person viewing the image is the same. We have a Photoshop video outlining some methods of adjusting contrast, but the main contrast adjustments of photos should be performed in the raw processing stage. Be sure to watch the video lessons, the Tone Curve tab lesson 1, the Parametric curve, and also the Tone Curve tab lesson 2, the Point curve. And following that, watch the contrast adjustment video lesson using the highlights and shadows sliders. In this video, we will discuss the basic understanding of contrast, what we can do with raw processing software to modify contrast, and finally, we'll be looking at the advantages of adjusting contrast. First off, this image on screen is of medium contrast. I will switch over to this image, which is low contrast, and then this image, which is high contrast, and you will see the differences as I switch between low contrast and high contrast. In high contrast, we have very strong blacks and whites, and a clear definition between tones. In low contrast, the differences between blacks and the whites, and the differences between neighboring tones is less. Let's look at some pictures. This is low contrast, and this high contrast image has strong blacks and bright highlights. Another low contrast image, a bright image, but there is no dark tones. Everything is very light, but it's still low contrast. This image is high contrast, with strong blacks and strong highlights. This image is high contrast again, strong deep shadows, with bright hot highlights. This image, we would consider as medium contrast. There is detail in the dark areas, and detail in the highlights. This image here would also be considered as medium contrast, with detail in both the shadow and the highlights. And this final image is high in contrast, bright strong highlights, and deep shadows. What is contrast? Contrast is the relationship, or difference between tonal ranges in an image. A high contrast image has larger differences between tones, and a low contrast has less difference. Contrast can take a long time to learn and master, but it's important to understand some key elements about contrast. There are three basic areas of contrast. Subject contrast, the actual contrast of a subject. And remember, the subject in the photograph is everything in the photograph. A landscape image is the subject, a portrait and its background is the subject. The second contrast area is the lighting contrast, the amount of contrast in the light at the time of taking the picture. And finally, editing contrast, where we edit and change the contrast in digital editing software, such as Camera Raw and Photoshop. And the final contrast in an image is the combination of these three elements. A picture of a low contrast subject can be high in contrast if it is photographed under high contrast lighting conditions, or when additional contrast is added during the digital editing stages. And also, a high contrast subject could look low in contrast if photographed in low contrast lighting. We often refer to low contrast as being flat. There is no perfect range of contrast. It all depends on the subject, the lighting of the subject, and the editing changes. In Camera Raw, there are several tools for specifically altering contrast, but we must bear in mind that any time we make any tonal adjustments, we are altering contrast. When we set the black and the white points of an image in Camera Raw, we are altering contrast. When we alter color, we are adjusting the appearance of contrast, and of course, when we use the contrast-specific tools, we are obviously altering contrast. Therefore, at what stage of the raw processing do we alter contrast? Contrast editing changes should occur After you have set the basic exposure and set the black and white points, and after any other editing changes, because these prior settings change the contrast too, and any contrast edits may require you to go back and reset the black and white points. Let's now look at some images to see a little bit more about contrast. I will be using saved snapshots in this example. Make sure you look at the video, Saving Raw Files Part 2, Saving Snapshots, for more information on snapshots. This image is very low in contrast, and photographed in low contrast light. The histogram is very central, and it is typical of a low contrast image. Activating the second saved snapshot. And this is with the white and black points having been set, and you will notice that there has been an increase in contrast and color. The third snapshot is with additional contrast added. I will now cycle through these three stages, no processing, and then the white and black points set, and the third stage, with contrast added. Let's look at what happened to the image. Processing the black and white points resulted in increasing contrast, and increased color, and finally with the additional contrast, we also get a further increase in sharpness, contrast and color. Onto this image. The first snapshot is with no processing, and it has higher contrast in both the subject and the light. It has a histogram that almost fills the entire range. Looking at the second snapshot, with the white and black points set, and the increasing contrast is very small in comparison to our first example image. The third snapshot is with contrast added. There is also more detail in the image, and there is also more color. With this third image, the contrast would already appear to be quite high, even with no processing, but it doesn't have a deep black, as you can see from the histogram being vacant, on the left-hand side. The second snapshot sets the white and the black points, with just a mild increase in contrast and color. The histogram now looks fuller. The final snapshot is with contrast added, and the image has a richness in contrast and color. In conclusion, we should set the white and the black points first, as this adds contrast, and then we may add more contrast to suit the image. There are 3 additional videos to watch for more contrast control, but before we conclude this lesson, let's pause briefly and look at the difference between the contrast slider in the Basic tab and other methods to adjust contrast. The contrast slider in the Basic tab will act like a seesaw. It will lift highlights and drop shadows in proportion, or it will darken highlights and lift the shadows in proportion, and therefore adjust the contrast. Increase the contrast slider and the highlights are getting brighter, and the shadows are getting deeper. Return that back to 0. If I reduce the contrast slider, the highlights go darker, and the shadows get lighter. I'll do that again. Reducing the contrast, shadows become lighter, and highlights become darker. Double-click and reset to 0. Let's now have a look at this on some images. Increasing the contrast and everything changes. Highlights become lighter, and the shadows become darker. Reduce the contrast now. The image looks really flat. On this next image, increase the contrast, and the image looks sharper and denser. Decreasing the contrast, and it starts to look flat and loses sharpness. Increase again, and it looks much better. Increasing the contrast slider will increase the highlights, and it will darken the shadows. You'll also notice that this image looks sharper and more detailed with this contrast increase. But if I reduce the contrast, and the image starts to look flat, the highlights drop, and the shadows become lighter, not a good look. Return this back to 0. Let's now come back to the grayscale image, and have a look at other ways to adjust contrast in a more specific manner. I'll come over to the Tone Curve tab. The Tone Curve tab is explained more in our 2 videos on the tone curve. I will lift up the lights it's just affecting the light side of the tones, not the shadows, but because this is lifting the light tones and making a greater difference when compared to the shadows, it is therefore changing the overall contrast. Note, changing one tonal area will always change contrast. I will drop the darks slider to darken the shadows after the lights are changed. These are more localized adjustments, lifting the lights and then dropping the darks, and this is known as a mid-range contrast boost. We'll tell you a secret: adding just a small amount of mid-range contrast will improve nearly every photograph. Onto this image, and instead of using the basic tab to lift the highlights and drop the shadows together, I will simply come over to the dark slider and drop the darks to increase the contrast of the image. The image looks darker, but it also looks better. Come to the highlight and lift those up just a little bit and get a more defined contrast adjustment and a far better result. On this image, simply to lower the darks, and by lowering the darks, it's starting to increase the contrast, and things are looking quite dynamic. Lift up the highlights, that's a bit too much, then lower the highlights. With this image again, I could drop the darks, and just by dropping the darks, the image starts to look different. The highlights, at this stage, haven't been changed. It's good to experiment with what level of change suits the image. It can take some experimenting. And lift up the highlights just a tiny bit, and you can see that these local contrast adjustments are really quite effective. In conclusion, contrast adds depth and sharpness to a photograph. Contrast makes color appear stronger. Adjust contrast after you have set the exposure and the white and black points. The contrast slider in the basic tab will adjust the light and dark tones in proportional amounts, and try to use the curve tab for adjusting more specific areas of contrast. Take your time, enjoy your photography, and practice as much as you can.